So it then creates the new way and formations of work. So, and when you then look at that mode of production that ushered in, which is the dominant one, it had a scenario of exploitation. That was one of the major limitations of that. So when societies organized, political parties organized, people organized, the scenario of exploitation was a big elephant in the room as the mode of production and of work. Now, the one that's coming now, which is not my view, it's Noah Harari's view, is that the post-capitalist scenario creates an irrelevant scenario, a scenario of irrelevance, of a surplus people not necessarily engaged. So that scenario then demands also an adjudication, just like exploitation scenario demanded the response. The scenario of irrelevance. So I was thinking you could then, when you were talking about Africa, maybe could you comment to say, are there some things you can think through or you can reflect back to us on how we can mitigate irrelevance? How do we become relevant where work has just changed its structure? Thank you.
Ndwana.
Thank you so much, Barry, and good morning, and thank you so much, Steve. Great hearing from you. I suppose we needed to have more time because you did not cover all your material. Quite interesting. Perhaps if time can be found to have round two, if that is in any way possible. I've got a question slash a comment, Steve. I'd like you to comment on it. Yeah, this is such a loaded subject. Economics in its nature is, we all know it, after all, is a study of social sciences. And I've gathered some literature that economics cannot be sufficient to predict future because of what I've said. And we all know that there are often disequilibriums between theory and application of economics, and which, I don't know, makes me be hesitant to appreciate it and welcome it. I haven't done much reading on this, to appreciate it and welcome it as a significant determinant to how future will look like. I would like your comment on that. Then the second and the last part of my comment is on the AI. Again, we do understand that we are continentally and different parts of the world. We are at different stages of advancement to even the fourth industrial revolution. And Africa, I can claim that we're not there yet. We are, I would say, 15 years back when it comes to the advancement and adaptation to what the fourth industrial revolution demands and expects of us. With that background, can we then say, appreciating the scope of the future of work, using the pillar of AI as a determinant to that, can that apply in Africa the same way it would apply in Europe, and maybe if the advancement when it comes to AI is anything to go by? I hope my question is not too complicated. Otherwise, thank you so much, Chair, and thank you, Steve, once more.
And then I'm going to just ask if we can indulge just Martin and Ian, and then Ian, Sir, you can reply. There's also an interesting comment in the chat from Andre. But Ian and Martin, you can go, and then Martin.
Yeah, no, maybe let me just make it short. Thank you, Steve, for that presentation. Yeah, I just want to just latch on something that Taffy was raising, and maybe just emphasize this bit, seeing that you've got this slide open now on decolonize, decarbonize. So maybe just talk through how do we make this preferable future realizable in the short and medium term going forward. And again, it asks or invites us to start thinking differently about how we view work, how we interact with youth, how we leverage off the youth. Because again, as you said in the introduction, 2/3 are not optimally engaged, depending on your definition of work. But again, just how do we change things for the better so that everyone sees and is optimally utilized according to whatever conceptions or self views that they have about what they should be doing or spending the majority of their time on. Thank you.
And then Martin.
Yeah, Sif, thanks very much for a very stimulating presentation. It's a pity we didn't get it beforehand, because then we could have probably jumped straight into the scenarios and discussed those. But nevertheless, I know that we haven't got much time, so I'm not going to go into detail in some of the things I wanted to raise. The first thing I wanted to say is, are these futures and these scenarios not gendered as well? And what are the consequences for gender? Because I think, we often kind of overlook, we think that the technology is gender neutral, but it isn't, in fact. So that's the one thing. Are these scenarios not gendered? First of all. The second thing I wanted to say is that, you know, are we not too uncritically looking at a future sort of, again, determined by the North, by the global North, in terms of decarbonize, decolonize, and so on? I see nothing in your futures about how our existing realities, our existing work, will be transformed and be part of this. For example, our mining sector and the role of the mining sector in a natural resource sector. I mean, we're almost moving just too critically into a decarbonize, and and um, and even that is critical in terms of colonization, because decarbonizing could be another form of colonization by just uncritically implementing sort of Western technologies without the wherewithal to develop them. Like the German scenarios that we have, global. I mean, the whole of Africa must have German windmills. Are they windmills? No, they're not. They're called something else. But basically, wind energy technology that we don't have any control over. So for me, that's a kind of a weak point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin. Sir, you can respond to those, and then we'll just identify for the next round those who. But I think the point Martin's making is just exciting me. I think that's a point that, for me, you've touched on, but I think it will. I'm looking forward to your response on that one also.
Yes, yes. No, thanks. Yeah, it's all of these things are big fields in and of themselves, and one doesn't claim to neither take on economics as a discipline, nor nor have all the answers. But I just want to first comment on Papama Ngandi on the chat there. I mean, I didn't get to go into that at all now, and I mean, I had more than enough. I could have probably just covered the literature as a seminar on its own. On the notion of weighted, I think it's definitely actually in the thesis when I write it, which I must still write up 1 or 2 papers. So this is part of helping to write 1 or 2 papers coming out of it. The notion of weighted, I bring it in a lot. And when we think of youth, and is then, the notion of weighted is dual, right? So, or in a sense, weighted is not passive. So a lot of the work on weighted also emphasizes that, well, people are getting by. So the hustle is a way of dealing with weighted, so not as in weighted is passivity sitting back, but of course that is also maybe it's a dual reality. And maybe there's questions around, are we a society in weighted? Because if we do not have a vision, and we don't have a sense of where we're going, does the whole society become weighted? But that's a big probably quite a big and ambitious argument to make. Yeah, no, Taffy, I mean, I think you're obviously absolutely right. I agree from that the mode of production defines how work is organized, and I suppose that's part of where the idea of the 4th industrial revolution has come in. I mean, I'm not going into that. There's different arguments. Is it the 4th? Is it the 3rd? Whatever, So, but that is, and does sort of manufacturing paradigms, is it sufficient to argue that we are in a different mode of production? I suppose that's the debate. Is it a new contractive wave? Is it not a new contractive wave? Or when are we expecting the sixth contributive wave to take part. And yeah, are people irrelevant? But I think that's the thing for me, right? So even on Martin's one, and we didn't. That's why I left that one. It's an extract. So the scenarios are written almost as little fictional pieces. So each scenario has got a two-person dichotomy. Of course, they are full of weaknesses and full of maybe. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a fiction writer, right? So they might be full of weaknesses, but they've got this sort of two people. And the notion of decolonize, decarbonize for me is not one that is preempted. The decolonize, decarbonize for me is an opening up and asking questions. It's a future not yet defined. It's a future that must be different because we don't know. And it's a future that must be recreated. So for me, it's not one that is determined by somebody else. And in the stories, a lot of those things are being questioned, you know. And there's the notion you're talking about almost like energy colonization. I think Tebucho on our ECSECC group posted, you know, it's the big hawks of net zero, right? And climate finance that sort of allows countries like my native Norway, that I'm going back to now, to continue to prospect for fossil fuels while you give climate finance. So hugely problematic. So I'm not preempting, you know, it's more using those ideas to actually as a way to say, could this be the future decolonized? What does that look like, you know? And I think that talks to the surplus and the people as irrelevant, or do we cease to be relevant because we do not have paid work? The question then becomes, how do you recreate? And it's not a new question. It's the question of utopianists, or if you look at the future of work literature, there's a Andre Ghoz in 1999 kind of wrote a book, and a lot of the arguments that's being made now is very similar. In any way, it's the left-wing kind of arguments where work is exploitation anyway. And I think also to defreeze your question there for me is, yeah, like you gotta open up our minds, you know. We should not expect that 2 million jobs will do it. It's absolutely necessary, and we must work towards that in the short term. But unless we actually rethink, and the we is a big royal we, you know, a multiplicity of political forms of political agencies rethinks and does it differently, the kind of assuming that we are on the same trajectory, I think it doesn't hold. So luckily in this case, I wasn't doing policy work, so I don't have to provide the answers that's being asked for. So Nzwana, I'm going to comment on your AI one. I think the issue of the role of economics in understanding the future is one of many disciplines. I mean, I believe in transdisciplinarity as difficult as it is, and future studies is transdisciplinary. So I'm not going to take on the profession, but I think you've got to draw on a whole range of different disciplines, and maybe most fundamentally, or also including the arts. And I think part of the limitation of the full work for me is that I didn't get to explore images from popular culture, for example, you know, but only looked at policy discourse. But on your second one, is AI, are we too far behind? No, and I think the argument is not that AI is the only driver, you know. And if you take AI now to sort of encompass a range of digital technologies, making assumptions about connectivity, and there's a lot of work in the actual text. I explore a lot of that. I mean, the arguments that say infrastructure, skills, and so on, it's actually preventing the uptake of AI, but it will be there in some form. We don't know exactly how big, we don't know what resistance, we also don't know if it's just purely digital colonialism, you know. But if you look at signals, so you maybe some of the signals are weak, but if we take some of the signals like natural language processing, little projects that take place at township level that is looking at, I think there's some particularly around Cape Town that is looking at the natural language processing in African languages. Some of them are funded by Google and so on, meaning that they are just under the ambit of digital colonialism. Some are not. You know, there are movements to be able to develop technology outside of the big tech companies. So let's take it as a weak signal. It's not to say it will be, but it will exist in some form. Who will control it? Who will develop it? Will we develop alternatives to the big global tech companies? that is the question. For now, most of it is also funded by Amazon, Google, and so on and so on, you know. So it may not be, but it will be there in some form. What form? Which companies will collude with the state and so on? That I think is what, you know, what we will um, what the questions are. But you know, AI as a kind of encompassing a whole range of other digital technologies. I think you can take, and I think Herbert is on here. We've had this argument in another process. I think you can take ubiquitous, so ubiquitous connectivity. I think we can make the assumption that it will happen eventually. You know, if it doesn't happen in the next decade, it might happen in 2 decades time, of course, unless there's a wild card, like something happens, you know. But you know, I haven't gone into that.
I've got another hand. Papama, is that you can come? I'm not
I
sure.
just want to deal with the gender thing. So no, yeah, definitely. Futures are gendered. Work is gendered. I've not specifically looked at it in this research. I mean, it's my master's thesis, mini thesis. I'm not specifically looked at it, but it definitely is. I mean, already a lot of the research looks at how the future of work will affect men and women differently, what assumptions we make, but also the whole notion of work. So the reproductive work, because if we take this broad notion of work, you know, it takes us into who's responsible for reproductive work. Are we expecting changes in gender relations? If, you know, will males have more free time, you know, and women do the reproductive work? So I think those are questions as well. Okay.
Papama, your hand is up. Papama, did you have a question?
Yeah. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Siv, for the presentation. I think one of the things that strikes me is the tension between decolonizing and decarbonizing, and I think someone sort of touched on that earlier. But I think I wanted to just expand on that moment on waithood that Siv had acknowledged. Um, you know, one of the concerns that I have sometimes is when we have these kinds of discussions, we sort of talk to ourselves, and so a lot of the people who are the subjects of what we are exploring are obviously left out of the conversation. And what I found very interesting in what Siv was saying was around the gig workers themselves. And when you look at the fact that majority of our people are generally occupying low-paying jobs in any case, you find that they are already located within that realm of employment that is precarious in its very nature. So, for an example, if you look at a place like East London, where there's a growing number of young sort of Uber drivers. Another Uber driver is also a guitarist, for argument's sake, so it doubles up to kind of supplement his creative work. You find that it's I'm not trying to romanticize the struggles of gig workers themselves. You find that it's not something fundamentally foreign to try and survive within that realm of uncertainty, because they come from households that have to make things work with limited resources in most cases. So I think what for me is I'm not sure if it was substantially covered in the way we imagine the future of work, is we need to find a way to 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 have our discussion a lot more pointed towards those realities, so that there are short-term solutions to even a 2050 type of picture, because it also it's not actually in our best interests to always commit our society to these grand pictures of like a far away and distant year when unemployment is causing undesirable spin-offs in terms of our social well-being in the current status. So what does it mean to intervene in the realm of unemployment for youth who are getting demoralized and who are getting depressed in the current status of things? Because while we look at the bigger picture, there's also the fact that we are manufacturing mental illness in the process, so that becomes an added complexity in the long term. So I think what I'm yearning for is, what are the short-term interventions in terms of the future of work that we are discussing? And I think I'm going to end on this point, Siv.
for me, the crux of, and I like what you said about, are we a country in waithood? We probably are, and I suspect linked to that is the kind of generational gaps that we tussle with across the spectrum. The young person who leaves home in the morning is leaving a set of parents who are totally disconnected to this kind of future that they are contending with on a daily basis. And at a governance level, as a society, we are led by people who are totally disconnected to that same future as well in terms of the rapid changes that are happening. So at some point, we need to find quick wins for our society in terms of how we imagine the future of work. I think that's where I'd like to kind of contribute as far as what I imagined about waithood. Thanks.
Thanks, Papama. Yeah, so I think that was Martin's. You coming back again, Martin? With the hand?
If I may.
Yes, you may, sir.
One very last quick comment, basically. I think underpinning all of this, all of these scenarios and everything, is one question actually. The extent to which we can socialize the innovation, the extent to which we can socialize innovation will basically shape the scenarios. And the question then becomes, how do we do that? Because that's the real objective. If we can socialize innovation, then AI becomes a center of value that can be redistributed socially. It doesn't become a threat to us as a society. It actually becomes what in the Communist Manifesto is called releasing people from work and allowing them to go fishing in the morning and reading poetry in the afternoon. In other words, to become real humans, rehumanize us. So for me, that question is like at the heart of this is how do you re-socialize innovation, because it's accruing to individuals, and that's what's actually accruing that huge inequality between the poor and the rich. It's because innovation is disproportionately the returns to innovation are disproportionately return, and it's in all sectors. It's in health, it's in media, it's in AI, it's etc. etc. So for me, that's the real question. How do we do that? And how do you do that as government? Government can just regulate the innovation sector, but obviously, as at the heart, at the sort of core of at the periphery of the global economy, it's actually much more difficult. But for me, that's the heart of all of these scenarios.
Yeah, thank you for that, Martin. And if I may, I just want to concur with that to say, and my question that I saved also was, how do we envision kind of a post-capitalist futures where we think of technology and we think about not just work, but as we think into the future outside of kind of capitalist modes of production, living, and circuits of capital. And where would you, for example, do we look at post-growth? Is there possibilities in post-growth and the work of Escobar, Magnolo, thinking about, for example, the pluriverse, a kind of a alternative futures that take us beyond this notion of growth. And so the one last point that I wanted to also ask was in terms of history. Martin raised something earlier about the impact of he was talking about the mineral energy complex. And as we think about the transitions taking place, what will the impact be going forward? And so for me, the issue is a country like South Africa with the kind of path dependencies, the histories of dispossession, even how labor was created. I mean, how we became subjects of a capital accumulation here through labor, through bonded labor, where where black bodies could not be idle and could not refuse to work in the service of white landowners. So I'm just thinking about it in that context, perhaps not only about work, but broader as we think about the transition. I think Martin, Papama, and Taffy alluded to some of that. Thanks, sir.
Okay, thanks. No. So I think it shows, in a sense, you can deal with the future of work as in what is the future of the job, and that it will take you in one direction. And taking this different thing, which makes us look at work as fundamentally political, if you like, it raises a much broader set of questions that again you can take down to I mean they are important, I think, for all forms, for all sorts of political formations. And I mean we are also going through politically tough times, you know, in a country, and yeah, anyway, let me not go down that route, but I think I think the point was to show work as fundamentally political, and that the questions of work are not just the question of how is labor going to be, you know, controlled and organized, but can we, through thinking about different futures of work, actually re-envisage society. So of course it does, you know, it does become a fundamentally political question, because a future of continued exploitation, whether it is, you know, by old corporations or new corporations, you know, it's not something that we want. So could we, for example, use then the, you know, the questions of future of work to just have new sets of, there's not really new discussions, because people are having these discussions and people are working on these different things. And I think it could be quite interesting. I'm not sort of adopting simply something from the sort of just transition. I think it's something that has got to be, we don't have a choice, right? Because some things are changing by themselves. And
Yes.
unless there is active agency and mobilization and thinking around what just transition, I think it's a hook, you know. So I'm not using it here as a playbook, but more as a hook, because climate temperature increases and huge ecological shifts locally and globally, and the impact of that fundamental social impact, or yeah, again, on sort of economic and social organization is happening. So whether we think it's a good idea or not in its current form, just transition, society is going to change, just like how fast or how slow AI is and so on. It does stand to change in many fundamental ways social organizations. I think I'm slightly less, like, I'm not quite like, I'm much more hopeful than Harari, I think, you know, because deeply I just, you know, I believe in there's sort of human agency, you know. So
Yeah.
so in a sense, if these changes are happening anyway, you know, those are the present futures, as Barbara and Adam calls it. The present futures are those which we are as a result of our actions today, just like our, as you said, you know, our present and even our future is the result of actions of the past, you know. But then there are those which we can shape, and which really lies in the realm of agency, and agency as state policy. I mean, many of the people in the room are working in that field. There's agency as in organized political agency in its traditional forms, and maybe new, more non-hierarchical, new forms of political organization that are also taking place, you know. And I think very much the sort of Feast Must Fall and was part of that. Maybe, yeah, was part of that. So, you know, agency is where there is hope, and linked to information, knowledge, understanding, and then these notions of images, like creating new images that we can work towards. And I've deliberately skipped the short-term interventions, because it's extremely difficult, and they've got to be across the realm. They got to be, I mean, I didn't get to go to it now, but this notion of the layered analysis, you've got to have, it's not enough to have solutions in one of these realms, right? So you've got the litany, the courses, the structures. It's not enough to have solutions at the level of the litany, but at the level of the litany, which is like the immediate problems in front of us, that's where the short-term solutions can be found, you know. Social courses is more your structure, system and structure. You've got to have solutions here, education system, economy, incentives, those kind of things. But there's also needs to be change at the level of worldviews, because if we don't change at the level of worldviews, you'll have another round of forms of exploitation, you know, just by different companies, by different forces, by yeah. And also, you know, what are the metaphors and myths that we use to express how we view this future? A lot of that is found in culture, religion, art, and so on, you know. But you your short-term interventions are here, but they're not enough. You know, you also need to rethink, I think, at all these levels. If for us to imagine a future that isn't dystopian, because my argument is that the present is dystopian. I was surprised, sorry, I know I must finish now. I was surprised not to find so many dystopian images, but in the sense that there's that picture, and it came from one of the workshops, the image of, you know, the young people waiting at the post office for the SRD, you know, for the 350 is maybe that's a dystopian present. So, you know, there's got to be hope for the future not to be more dystopian than the present, in a way.
Thanks for that. I see Lutando Jack. I see Lutando Jack's hand is up. Lutando, you want to come through?
Yes, thanks, Barry, and thanks, Steve, for the presentation. I know you did not probably deal with this directly, but I just want to, given everything that you have said, as well as the questions, my own assessment when we're confronted by complexity, which is basically what we're dealing with, we tend to, and I'm just going to be provocative, Martin, we tend to default into isms, as we are doing now. And of course, I guess because some of us are materialists, we're bound to then fall into that entrapment. But I think given what we are dealing with, which is a product of thinking, which is a product of intellectual labor, really. All what we're talking about is a product of intellectual labor. So probably those of us who are here in the South, don't we really want to revisit thinking and rethink thinking itself as a departure point? Because and part of rethinking perhaps is also really unlearning all these isms, which and I'm going to be provocative, which cloud, in my view, our creative potential, you know, in terms of at the level of thinking. Because I think we seem to be trapped, you know, in that, and end up being reactive instead of fostering our own path as informed by our own development trajectory and needs, of course, without decoupling ourselves. But I think the starting point is really rethinking thinking itself, because as you have said, everything that exists in society is a product of ideas. And now we are reacting to somebody's ideas, but what has happened to our own ideas? Because then everything else, including the agency that you're talking about, the agency ought to be informed by our aspirations, but we tend to react as opposed to really questioning ourselves at the level of thinking. So my long question is, don't we really need to rethink thinking itself, transform our thinking? Those of us who are in the South, so that we can really fashion our own development path, as opposed to always reacting to all these isms, which all of them come from the North, by the way, including all of them anyway. Thanks, Barry.